So we can understand the pointers of non-doership, and it can make sense to us intellectually, and yet we can find that in practice, when we're in daily living, the attachment to outcome still kicks in, and the beliefs in doership flower. And some of the feedback that I get from a particular group of seekers, because it's very different for everyone. Sometimes understanding the concepts penetrates very deeply, and the attachment to outcomes doesn't kick in. So I guess what I'm talking about here, or going to talk about here, is when, even though it's understood, something in our makeup is still, in practice, very much triggered by pain in the moment. And the reason that that happens is because the attachment to outcome, so attachment to outcome is just a name for a particular relationship to the flow of life, particular relationship to outcomes. So life is interhuman relationship. Essentially, that's what life is. And the other can be a family member, a friend, a neighbor, a work colleague, or a total stranger. That essentially is life, interhuman relationship with another. Family, friend, neighbor, work colleague, total stranger. That interaction usually involves outcomes. Just, speaking to someone, each moment is essentially an outcome. So how they speak to you, what the topic is, whether you agree with each other, whether they're nice to you or not nice to you. That's the pleasure or pain of the flow of life. And obviously it's not just interhuman relationship, there are also, you're in relationship to all the other objects, and some of those objects are not humans. And the same thing, in each moment there is an outcome. And it's either favorable or not favorable, pleasurable or painful. The attachment to outcome has got to do with our attitude to that to that pleasure or pain. It's an attitude that says, I need. And it's not just a thought. When I'm talking about this attitude, it's deeply, deeply ingrained as part of our makeup. So we don't think the thought that says, I need this to be a certain way. We know that that's ingrained in us because of the reaction that happens when it's not a certain way. And so that's our proof that there is this deeply, deeply ingrained belief that says, I need life to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Because when it's not, there is a reaction that when we look at it, we can deduct. I must have this makeup inside that says I need it to be this way because of how I feel when it's not this way. And so if that dynamic hasn't been undone, so what I'm going to talk about here is what I touched on yesterday, where we are encouraged to see life from outside of the spectrum of interconnected opposites. And attachment to outcome exists in a strong way when we are essentially, when we feel defined by things that are happening on this spectrum of interconnected opposites. And one of those interconnected opposites, one of the most important ones, is pleasure or pain, and right or wrong, good or bad. And in order to break that, we really need to start, at least it's a little exploration of practice, seeing everything without labeling it as good or bad. Now, inherently, even if you don't label it as big or small, good or bad, pleasure or pain, hot or cold, inherently it still is whatever it is. So if we don't label something hot, it still is hot without you labeling it. The labeling is highly connected to this attachment to outcome. So that's why I'm suggesting that if we find ourselves really still not grounded in our own being, where we can experience ourselves in such a way that we know that I am complete, which once again, it's not a thought that says I am complete. There is a feeling, a relaxation, a non-involvement with outcomes. And as a result of that, we can deduct again, oh, I must know myself in this moment as complete because of the relaxation. So if that grounding into oneself isn't available, then what I'm talking about in today's satsang may be something that can be practiced, once again, not at any particular point in time, but as you're going through your day. And I'm saying it can be practiced, but I don't really mean it as a practice. I mean it as a new way of functioning, simply because we're having this talk, which is new conditioning. It becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning, and then that movement happens automatically, which means you're not doing it, but rather you've been redesigned in order for that to automatically happen. And the suggestion is that when we are looking at life and experiencing the outcomes, as soon as the thinking that starts judging kicks in, for us to notice that it kicks in because we have essentially labeled something as good or bad within the thinking process. And it is a matter of reframing that from a position outside of this spectrum of good or bad, where we see all of the colors. So let's say we call pain and bad and all the things we would not like the color black, and all the things we like the color white. And when we're invested in this spectrum of pleasure and pain, we tend to push away black. We say that is bad, that is black, that is pleasure, that is pain, that is not good, and resist it attitudinally. And with the white, we say, oh, this is good, and we have a story about how, yes, we want this and we'll actually like it to stay forever. And in a way, there's a rejection of black and an acceptance of white. And so what I'm suggesting is that whenever that relationship kicks in, that we can step back and say, actually, in the bigger picture of things, as part of the whole of life, it isn't either good or bad. So relative to specific benchmarks, things are good or bad. But if you take those specific benchmarks away, because the specific benchmarks, like good health or safety or good manners, those are specific benchmarks. But they are not life as a whole. That's a very specific benchmark. So what we're doing in this exercise is we're trying to appreciate life as a whole. And so for a while, we're going to practice dropping, judging things according to specific benchmarks and seeing them in relation to life as a whole. And so from the perspective of life as a whole, we know that life is a life of interconnected opposites, of good and bad, of health and disease, of wealth and poverty, of big and small, innumerable interconnected opposites. And so they're all valid as part of life. So instead of saying, well, that is good or that is bad, we say, that's life. Understanding that the full range is always valid. This is where, it is what it is comes from. So someone would say to someone else who's starting to see life like this, and they say, isn't it terrible that the government has decided to implement this law? And instead of the person going in, I really think that these people should be hung up and kicked out of office. That's going in and making that aspect of life invalid in a sense. Saying it shouldn't be. Now, once again, relative to certain benchmarks like social equality, we might be able to say, this is really bad. But that's what we're so used to, is always judging everything in context of a section of life. And so we never really get to know what life as a whole is. So for a while we're going to stop assessing everything relative to specific benchmarks. And so the person who's exploring this hears one of their neighbors or friends talking about this. They might recognize that there is an assessment that it is bad, and then because the attachment to outcome is in place, the person is forced to feel attacked by that situation, attacked on a level of self, and hence there is an uncomfortableness. And that story about the decision gets carried on horizontally in time. It'll keep coming up. That'll be their thing, that whenever they're talking to anyone, they're complaining about these inequalities. So this other person that's exploring things differently says, it is what it is. Or, well, it's not really good or bad, it just is. Now, remember, I'm not suggesting that this is how we will end up living life in an integrated manner. But in order to get to an integrated way of living life, life needs to undo certain dynamics that are in place. And so this exploration, which is to really understand that in the bigger picture of life, and so the basis on which we understand it is by understanding that life is always a life of duality, meaning interconnected opposites. Health, disease, wealth, poverty, big, small, hot, cold, good, evil. And there are great acts of kindness that happen in the world and great acts of cruelty. And often we say, but why is there so much cruelty in the world? We might say, why does God, if God created all of this, why did He create cruelty? And the answer is a simple answer, is God created a manifestation of duality. This particular manifestation is a manifestation of duality, interconnected opposites. Fundamentally, we could say it's a non-duality, where when we step back and we see that all of the interconnected opposites And the reason that I'm saying interconnected is that they are not separate from each other. They're interconnected opposites, means they're part of a whole. So the whole of life, we can say, is a non-duality. But when you look into the non-duality and see what is there in the detail, there are these interconnected opposites. So the basis on which we can understand the answer to the question, why is there so much cruelty? Why is there poverty in the world? Why do young babies have disease? And the answer is because there are people that are healthy, because there are people that are well off. And so life will include the interconnected opposites. And so from that understanding of that is the nature of life, we can start to really see, well, it isn't fundamentally good or bad. It's just life unfolding in this moment, sometimes good, sometimes bad.
Yes, what you're describing is interesting because I had also an experience when I didn't know about something. There was not labeling about good or bad, but was more like curiosity. And in this curiosity was more like, okay, and when I discover or when I say, okay, what these things do or what it is, or somebody tells you, then you start to labeling if it's like danger or if it's not danger.
Mm-hmm.
But before that, which I didn't know the thing, was like more curiosity, what is there? And there was like this space of discovering the thing which was not labeling into it.
Mm. Yeah, that's right. So that, in a way, is why we get asked in spirituality to become innocent, like a child, to not know, the state of I don't know is very linked to this, because once again, what is can seem negative according to a specific benchmark can be beneficial according to another benchmark. And so we tend to judge everything from our very personal point of view. And what we want to be able to do is start to see life from a less centric position, a less personal perspective, and understand that I actually fit into the whole of life. I'm part of the whole of life, and so if I'm going to know myself fully, I need to be able to know life fully, which means to be curious, be in a position of openness to all the aspects of life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there needs to be some rationales, like, well, actually, I don't really know that this is bad. It's bad from this perspective, but why am I holding on to that perspective when there are many other perspectives in life? Different people will see it differently. That particular decision will impact different people differently. And so if we're interested in understanding the underlying non-dual nature of life, so we know the duality, and they're not, non-duality and duality are not contradictories. They're not in opposition with each other. They're not mutually exclusive. So the yin-yang symbol is a representation of what I'm speaking about here. Is that you can look at the yin-yang signal and say it's like a singular coin, and that the black and the white are not really separate components. They are part of the one whole. and they just appear to be two because of the distinction of the black and the white. And so coming to see the non-duality is to see the yin-yang symbol as a single circle. That's seeing the non-duality of it. And yet, they don't make the yin-yang symbol just white or just black for a reason, because life is duality. Say black and white, and they're interconnected and supporting, which is why the shape of the yin-yang is the way it is. And so to be able to see life on an integrated level is to see the non-duality of it and the duality, and see that it's not about picking one or the other, but seeing that they are complementary, that one needs the other. Yes, and ideally we have a perspective where we get to see both the duality as part of the non-duality. And so what that means is there is an experience created, and the experience is a singular experience, a bit like music, a singular piece of music. And then within that music there are lots of what can appear to be separate components. They can be separated out, but when we hear them as a cohesive whole. And it's really not about saying that there is just a cohesive whole and no separate bits, and it's not about saying there are just a whole lot of separate bits and not a cohesive whole. It's about understanding that the two are part of a paradox, and that to understand it completely, you need to understand it from both perspectives simultaneously. So life is fundamentally a non-duality. Everything arises and is interdependent on each other. And in practice, we know that in practice the chair is not the same as the tree. And this is the separation that comes to an end, is not a separation on the experiential level. So on the experiential level, the chairs continue to be different from the trees. The hot and cold continue to be different from each other on an experiential level. Food that is to your liking and food that is not to your liking continue to be different on an experiential level.
Which is interesting, like, I just got a thought now. For some things, if we can label, like, then this can change. But hot and cold cannot be changed. It is what it is. Mm-hmm. But our labeling to one thing can be changed if it's seen from different perspective. The some things is what it is, some can change, all right? Or
well, there's a lot of nuances in that, because what is hot to one person might not be hot relative to something different. You can have white wine at room temperature that you consider to be too hot, and red wine at room temperature is not considered to be too hot. So it is still hot and cold, still
but
relative.
But if you take, like, I don't know, ice and like hot water, which is like boiling water, it's a hot and cold. And
yes,
but it's not because of labeling. It is what is when you put a hand, it's hot and it's cold.
Cool. Yes,
Yeah.
relative to your particular biological makeup, that's correct, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right, because I mean I put that forward as well, saying that you don't have to think something is hot or cold for it to be biologically hot or cold. Right? So that's right, but even though there is a biological sensation of hot or cold, there can still be a relativity to that hot and cold.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see if I go back to. I'm not sure where I was. No, before that. Okay.
Roger, what is your explanation on those two dots, black dot in white part and white dot in the black part?
It's just part of the pattern.
Decoration.
Yeah, no, but it has meaning to show you that everything has its interconnected opposites on various different levels that make up the whole. So if you look at the dots from this perspective and the black and the white as part of a whole all the time, you'll see that it creates a symmetry.
Is that there's one in the other, right?
Yes, the white has a black dot, and yeah. But it's not necessarily the good and the bad.
It's like showing you the relativity of each other, no?
Actually, to be honest, I've looked at the dots and they fit well in my, but I didn't come up with a very detailed explanation. I'm sure if we Google yin yang and its meaning, we'll have.
So I had a question about expectations with regards to relationships, whether it's coworker, partner, children, whatever. I feel like there's still something I'm not seeing that's in my system. Like I can feel it in my body, like right behind my solar plexus, a stuckness and a resistance to letting that in. And there almost seems to be a fear there, then it'll be the end of relationship, or like not like, I don't know, being a doormat, or like those are the fears that my mind is projecting. So I guess one question I have is, do you experience expectation in any of your relationship, or nothing? You're completely free of that? Like.
So we need to create a distinction between your biological preference and expectation. So expectation is got to do with the attitude to the outcome. And the outcome is going to be pleasure or painful relative to your biological preferences. The expectation or attachment to outcomes is part of the psychological response, which is the level on which the suffering exists. And the outcome and your preferences are part of the flow of life, which is part of the circumstantial. And so non-attachment to outcome doesn't mean that we then become uninterested in maintaining a life that is as pleasurable as it can be. So if someone said, well, you're saying that the attachment to outcome has fallen away from you. So in that case, why don't you chop off your arm to prove it? I said, well, that doesn't, that's just stupid. For as long as my arm is functioning and part of my life, I'm very grateful for that. It's part of the pleasure of having full functionality. If, however, life brought about a circumstance where that was no longer the case, I would experience the pain, the physical pain of that happening at the time, and then afterwards the inconvenience pain. However, without an attachment to outcomes, I can confidently say that knowing that my capacity, be it full functioning or less than full functioning, isn't a determining factor of myself, of knowing the core of myself. And therefore, if life brought about that situation, there would be pain. So the end of attachment to outcome doesn't mean circumstance is not going to be painful, but the suffering that could so easily arise if there was a certain dynamic in place won't arise. So when it comes to relationship, it can become very clear that in a relationship you don't appreciate being treated like a second-class citizen. You don't appreciate not being listened to, you don't appreciate being shouted at, you don't appreciate a whole lot of things, which means those actions are not in line with your preferences. And that's very normal. We're always going to have those preferences, even after attachment to outcome falls away. If you are in a situation in life and you can't do anything about it, let's say you're in prison, you're going to be faced with, I suspect, very many situations that are not in line with your preferences. And there's nothing you can do about it. Well, there might be things you can do about it, but you don't know what the outcome is going to be. And there are some things that you won't be able to change. So if you find in your life that you are in a situation that is painful and you can't change it, well, that's destiny in that moment. It's always going to be destiny in that moment, because once something has happened, you can't change it. You can do what you can to change it so that it is not like that in the future. Having done what you can, the outcome's not in your control. You might get what you want, you may not get what you want. And all along with the different flow of life, the pain, the continuing pain, or the pain and then it changing into pleasure, what's most important is our attitude to the outcome. So the attitude of understanding that pleasure or pain is part of the flow of life, it's not in my control, and ultimately it doesn't determine my sense of self. That acceptance is peace in the face of pain, in the face of circumstance, regardless of what the circumstance is, pleasurable or painful. But that acceptance doesn't mean becoming passive and not doing whatever you can in the moment to try and fix the situation.
So can I share what, a good friend of mine a few months ago, we had a falling out, and she had been one of my best friends for 5 years. And I guess I'm still sort of, I'm experiencing guilt and doubt that I shouldn't have ended the friendship, and that my expectations were too high. So I'm not really sure what to do with that right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I'm experiencing what my mind is saying I'm experiencing what I shouldn't be experiencing, everything we're talking about, regret, guilt, shame, and here it is. And I don't want it, or, it's
Well, I would never say we shouldn't be experiencing that. I will put forward a description that says peace of mind is the absence of suffering. But peace of mind is not necessarily something that is available for everyone all of the time. And so suffering is very much part of life. It means that the guilt has been locked away, and it's probably a very beneficial thing to actually acknowledge the feeling.
How do you know if you're supposed to end a friendship or a relationship or not, or it's all predestined, so don't worry about it?
Yeah, life is really very simple from a certain perspective, which is if we can see that life turns out one way, only ever one way. It's a very valid question. So how should I live my life? If life is completely predetermined, how should I live my life? And it's really simple. In each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do.
How do I fully trust that in myself?
It isn't, we can never know what the outcome will be. So I'm not saying do what will give you the best outcome. I'm saying in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do.
And then that can change, yeah. So
well, once you do it, you can't go back, yeah. But you can do something different, if it's available to do something different, in the next moment. So the simplicity is, in each moment, life is unfolding as it's destined, and the destined unfolding in life includes the functioning of all human beings in each moment. And so that means that each of us are going to be doing exactly what we think or feel to do in each moment. And the outcome is never in our control. So the problem comes in when we second guess what we did or what we're about to do, where we look back and we say, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And from my perspective is, you're not the doer. You functioned according to destiny. You functioned according to your destiny and according to your friend's destiny. It was destined for her to behave the way she behaved. It was destined for you to feel the way you felt. And it was destined for you to then make the decision you made and then feel the pain that you felt and feel. And destined for her to feel whatever she felt. So this isn't saying not to feel the pain.
I don't even know what this is. It feels like love. It doesn't hurt anymore. It's like when I let myself feel sadness and stuff, it turns into experience of love.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's sadness again. And then but okay, I don't want to take over the session here.
Mm. See, but it's very valid. And when in satsang someone expresses an emotion because it comes up, it's very genuine. So it's worth looking at. The topic we had yesterday of emotional release is exactly this. That in that emotion there is the load of doership and attachment. So if it doesn't get to come out, it will keep rearing its head in the form of doership and attachment and feeling uncomfortable. And if it's given the space to come out, something quite magical can happen, which you just described, that the feeling that's so uncomfortable can sort of just transmute into a different experience where the feeling that you had a day before or 5 minutes before just seems very foreign. And it becomes very clear that the pain, that the suffering that was there wasn't actually because of the circumstance, but because of our attitude to the circumstance. Because once that energy is released, the circumstance is the same. And internally we say, well, actually it's not such a big deal. Whereas when the attachment and the guilt is in the system, we look at the circumstance and that suffering energy is saying, this is a huge deal, you know, I made such a mistake. That energy comes out and we look back and we really have a completely different perspective. Our feeling towards it is completely different.
And then whether you make things right, like make up or whatever or not, even that's predestined, then yeah, like if I were to go home and say I'm sorry or like I screwed up, or then
I mean, I personally find that with this perspective, once, if the energy is not there and you realize you made a mistake, it's just so easy to say, I'm really sorry. Yeah. I made a mistake.
And then I see some pride come up. But that's okay.
So it's interesting because the session or the topic just before your question was a topic of sort of saying, actually, it is what it is. It isn't good or bad. It is what it is. And that is more synonymous with just a witnessing of what happens and a witnessing of the outcomes rather than being heavily involved in the outcome. However, once that doership and attachment to a situation has happened in a certain way and locked itself in, if we just keep saying to that feeling, no, it's not good, to the circumstance, it's not good or bad, it just is, that's where we're mixing, I hesitate to say techniques, but they're not really techniques, movements. There are these different movements that are very valid at different times. And if we get confused and we start applying the rationale that says actually that it just is, you know, I've missed my bus, it's not really good or bad, it just is, because I don't know what my life, well, I do know what my life is meant to turn out like. It's meant to turn out like this. It's only bad relative to the idea that my life was meant to turn out with me getting on the bus and ending up at the place I thought I was meant to. So in those situations where we say, well, actually it just is, not good or bad, that's very valid. But when you have a different feeling, like the feeling that you have in this situation, then what might be being called for, what is more authentic, is to go on to, is for the movement of feeling and expressing and releasing, rather than witnessing from outside perspective. And if we only know about the witnessing from the outside perspective, saying everything just is, it's not good or bad, it turns into a bypassing of the energies that are sort of knocking on the door, wanting to come out. So this is useful distinction to have demonstrated in practice.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask, how about when some feelings of duality come, okay, and we know what it is, and according to the framework, let's say it's guilt, or let's say it's blame for someone for doing something, and how about sharing these feelings with other people? For example, something happens in work, and I go home, and my husband asks me, "How was your day?" And I'm really angry with someone that did something at work, and sharing this feeling. I know where it comes from. I know the framework, and I've done some investigation, but the feeling is still there, and I want to kill him. It hasn't gone away. And it's still there, and it needs to be expressed in some way. I mean, he can see I'm angry or something. And my question is, how valid is it to talk to people about our feelings? Most of the people I know, most people will not give a decent advice. It's not going to be according to the framework and according to the teaching. It's going to be okay, or you're right, and he's wrong or anything. But sometimes it's not like you're pressing the feeling. It's not something like you are. It does have a day in the sun. It's expressed. But I don't know if it's the right way, or it's better if you don't talk about it. What's the best way to deal with? I mean, if it comes up and you need to talk about it. You really need to talk about it. It's.
Well, it's if you're going to talk about it to someone who is seeing life from perspective of doership and attachment, and they're just going to reinforce the doership feeling that you have, it might make you feel good on one level, but it's not really the release that we're talking about, right? The release of the energy where we know it is stuck, doership, because they will actually confirm the way that you're looking at it from the doership point of view. Probably not so helpful. If you have someone that can hold space for you, where they understand that this is an energy that needs to be released, and they're not going to judge you, and they're just holding a space, then that can be very useful. But frankly, I think what we can do is just realize, if we can realize that this is doership energy, that your conscious way of seeing life. So if you ask someone, there's a part of you that says, well, actually, I know he couldn't have acted differently, and actually what he did is just inconvenient to me, and it isn't really touching deep inside me. However, you can feel that on another level, there is the uncomfortableness that is saying, no, this is very important and he could have done it differently, right? So if you have that understanding yourself, but you can feel the uncomfortableness, it's very valid if you can, maybe you make a little room in the house padded with, so it's soundproof, whatever, yeah? Go in the shower, or if you have a swimming pool, you dive in the swimming pool, and you just yell out that energy that is, that you can feel, that hates him for what he did, and you yell it out, right? And that is release, that is the emotional release of that energy. And while you're doing that, there's a part of you going, look at this crazy woman, But not from a judgment point of view, with an understanding that, wow, look, this is doership and attachment to outcomes energy. And you're seeing it as a movement towards peace of mind. And so I was sort of joking, look at this crazy woman. because there's a part of you that is impressed by how much force these reactions can have. But you're not involved in it, and yet you're still. Yeah, the energy is super intense. That's the nature of doership and attachment energy, especially the ones that have been repressed. So super intense. Like there are some deeply ingrained energies that may not even be from this life that can come up, where you actually, in the energy, feel like you have a vision of someone, and you can actually visualize killing them. You know, the hatred is that strong in those repressed energies. And we need to, in a way, learn that this isn't who we are, because often we're afraid to see that because we think, could I really be this person who wants to kill my parents in a brutal way? You know? And to understand, this is a doership and attachment energy that is not ultimately who you are. It's something that has been locked in place because of an old attitude to life. And that once that is released, then actually there'll be much less of that in the system. So, I mean, turning away from it because we don't want to acknowledge that we have this hatred actually leaves us in that same configuration, which means we can kid ourselves and say, oh, I'm not really that, because we don't want to see it. But we're more that when we haven't seen it than after we've seen it.
When we release that kind of energy, where does it go?
It's transmuted.
Is it possible to transfer it to another person?
If you really hate them.
No. I didn't mean that. But for example, I want to kill my parents in a brutal way, and I express that and I release some energy. Can I, let's say by accident, transfer it energy to Tanya or to children or something like that?
I mean, maybe we don't really understand the complexities of energy. If that happens, it's destiny, right? So they did something very, very bad, and it's their payback, you know. No, but it is destiny if that happens. And the truth is that that transference of energy could just as, because we don't understand the complexity of it, could happen when you're suppressing it. And it will get transferred without you even intending it. So if we try and figure everything out, we can end up getting more confused rather than understanding, actually, this needs to come out, and I'll leave it up to destiny where it goes. But the more likely, when something is released, it's transmuted. It's like the shouting or the hitting a pillow or whatever, the crying, it's energy going from one form into another form. And so it no longer, when it's released, it no longer exists in the same form that it existed before. So like a piece of wood that burns, the heat that comes off the wood is like the shouting or the crying, for example. And then you don't have the wood anymore, you have ashes. And the energy is destructive when it's in the form of the wood. When it's in the form of the fire and of the ashes, it's used up.
So it's not helpful to talk to other people about it at all?
Look, it's not, if you're angry with a particular person, frankly, I think it causes more confusion to talk to that person and express your anger at them. I know that's not exactly what you asked. If you feel that that's what's needed, then maybe that is best, to express your anger at the person you're angry with. If you can express it where you say, look, I understand what this is, I understand it's actually not personal, but I need to just get it off my chest. And then once you get it off your chest, we don't know what the consequences are of that. They might say, well, look, I think you're seeing this completely wrong, and I don't think we should see each other anymore. That's why it can be not necessarily so beneficial to express it to the person you're angry with. And the fact is, they might have died. They might not exist anymore. And if we needed to express to that person, then we'd be stuck because they don't exist. So what I'm getting at is we don't need to express it to the person that we're angry with. We can just express it as if they are there, and it can go out. And you're asking about expressing it to a third person, a third party. And yes, if that becomes, if that's something you find is available, which is, not always the case, if you might not have someone you can express it to that will receive it in a healthy way. But if you do find someone who you can express it to, then yes, by all means, it's when you're talking to them, talk to them without sugarcoating how you feel about the other person. Really dump that doership energy and attachment energy out. Which is why I find that if that movement where you can do it on your own starts to be something where you could do it every hour. When you're at work and someone does something and it's there, you go into your little room and you do it. You can get a cushion. Yeah. You take a cushion into work with you. You take the cushion into the toilets, make noise, put over your face and yell, into the cushion. And after you've yelled, you go, that's better. You go back out to your desk, you put the cushion in the drawer, and you carry on. And then 20 minutes later, you go back in with the cushion. Do
it again.
Do it again.
In a stressful workplace, and everybody goes to the toilet.
There's a big line of people with... But I mean, even, I was thinking because this releasing is so beneficial, if they had booths on the street, you pay 20 cents, then you go in and you have 2 minutes for 20 cents. It's soundproof, padded walls. And a camera, yes. But this is an interesting topic because, on the one hand, non-duality often says, this is that the way to freedom is not going into the stories. Because if you go into the stories and you have to release this story and that story and that story and that story, then you go on forever. And it's true. And that's why often non-duality says, this is not therapy. Because therapy is usually, and this is a generalization, it's not exactly true because there are a whole range of different therapists that will work in different ways. But generally speaking, because the majority of the population are not ready to look at life from a perspective of non-doership and non-attachment, and if you deliver a solution to someone who's not ready for that solution, it's not a solution. And so delivering another solution to someone who is ready for that solution, even though it might not be an ultimate solution, is much, 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 much more effective than delivering an ultimate solution that is going to have no effect. And so therapy is looking at suffering not as a fundamental error, but rather saying, yes, suffering is, very normal, and there's no error to it. It's just that it needs to be managed. And so often what is happening is there are techniques and management solutions that don't go to the root of the problem, and doesn't look at doership and attachment to outcomes as the root of all of one's suffering. And if in general therapy, and I don't even know, I apologize to therapists because when I'm saying this, because this is not the case for all therapy. But in some cases, or as a general rule, if someone can be brought back into what is called like a normal range, where the suffering isn't super intense, then now they're normal. Whereas from a non-duality point of view, what mainstream society calls normal is still seen as not knowing oneself. So non-duality says, it's a completely different solution that is being put forward here. It's about coming to know yourself truly, which is transcending certain boundaries. And once we can see a certain principle as being an erroneous way of seeing life, and it's a general principle, so the principle of seeing myself as the doer and the other as the doer, we now have a principle that can undo all of the loads of suffering that got put in place over all of our. So that is what is really meant by you don't have to go in and deal with each situation individually, because we undo what is referred to as the Goydian knot. You slice that, and then everything that rests on that collapses. However, that root is contained within all of those loads. So all of those loads have at their root doership and attachment to outcome, and then all of those sort of feed into what we would call the Goydian knot. And the way this gets undone is, firstly, we need to understand the principle and start to see it for ourselves. What see it in life means really see how I am functioning in each moment according to my makeup, and that I really can't function any differently. And that, it's unfortunate when outcomes are negative or painful for the other. I mean, I don't intend for it to be like that. I don't intend for outcomes to be painful for myself, but sometimes I function that way, and that's what happens. So if we really get to see that it's impersonal, if I could do it better, I'd do it better. But I just am not designed in that particular moment to function differently. Which is not an excuse, because someone would say, that's very convenient to say, you're designed a particular way and you can't function differently. That's great. Excellent excuse. So what if it's not an excuse? What if it's true? Then in a way it's unfortunate, because this is not delivering what everyone in life would like, which is pleasure, 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 pleasure. That's why some people will hear it and say, oh, that's very convenient. You say that if pain was delivered, then it was inevitable. they're not happy with that explanation because they're actually attached to pleasure, 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 and that explanation doesn't give pleasure, 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 because it's not saying, well, I can control everything that happens and I can ensure that everything is going to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. But if we can see that it's an accurate way of seeing things, then the fact it doesn't deliver pleasure, pleasure, pleasure is, you know, in a way it's, well, that's just how it is. And if we can then know that my completeness isn't dependent on the other delivering pleasure to me all the time, and me delivering pleasure to myself and pleasure to the other all the time, then the Gordian knot at the root of all of our suffering, it's at the root, but it's also, you know, it's a two-way thing. All of the individual events that happened in the past have that principle in them, and they're all feeding into what is sort of like one big root of this doership and attachment energy. So the first thing is we need to understand and start seeing that that is erroneous. It's in place. Life puts it in place. But now we're starting to see that it's not an accurate way of seeing life. And that is the beginning of life undoing what it put in place. Then, once the system is ready, the system, this is not, you're not choosing this. So if someone says that's not non-duality, well, this is what happens. So to me, it's the process of non-duality happening. When the system is ready, then these energies start coming up. Which ones come up, we don't choose. They just come up because there's a very intelligent process that happens. And so it can seem like we're dealing with this problem independently, and this problem independently, and this problem independently. And some people will say, you know, if you do that, you're going to be forever pulling out weeds. You know, there's 1,000, there's 1,000,000 events that have happened in your life that have been pleasurable or painful, and you can't go and resolve them all. What I say happens in the process is some of the significant ones come up, and the underlying principle that we've started to see as being the way life really is contrasted against what comes up in the energy, because the energy has an opposite principle at play, which is doership and attachment to outcome. The energy is released, and the part of us that is grounded in seeing life clearly witnesses that energy coming out as an energy from the past being released. And that then weakens the Gordian knot. So you've released one out of thousands, but it's a significant one. Why is it a significant one? Because that's the one that was presented. And then a week later, another one comes up, or a continuation of the first one. You can have some very significant circumstances from the past that will come up in sort of packages. And at some point, when enough has been released, and each time that happens there's more and more space, which means our understanding of non-doership gets stronger and stronger. At some point, enough of those have been released, and the main ball sort of dissipates, collapses, and the rest of them fall away without us needing to release them. So part of us being ready, in a sense, for this to happen includes a capacity to witness life. And that capacity is something that starts happening when the brain starts relating to life differently, and then we start experiencing the experience being designed, being created differently, such that there seems to be a watching perspective from a different perspective to where it used to be. And so what I started off speaking about, where we just start seeing life as it is without labeling it as good or bad, is part of that witnessing perspective, which is needed in order for us to then feel the energies, or it's needed in order for the witnessing of the energies when they come up to happen. And that's why everything, is so interconnected. In these teachings, they support each other. So when I say the energies are witnessed, there's a part of us that is not witnessing the energy, because the energy is absolute, complete involvement. So a part of us needs to be really blaming and hating the person for what they did. And another part of us, the witnessing awareness, will watch that happening. And it doesn't have to, we don't even need to, someone would say, well, am I watching it? Just be focused on letting it out. And something in us is going to register that. And that's the bit that is aware of it, aware of what we're doing. You can even record yourself if you like. If you record yourself and you listen back to what was being said from that energy, I hate you for what you did, you disrespected me, you da-da-da-da-da. And then you listen to it, and you can hear the doership and the attachment story in it, which means you get to see your particular dynamic, become familiar with your dynamic, because it usually there's a theme that is similar in many of the, that pervades many of the locked away energies from past circumstances. And if you don't record it, which may not be, the recording it is really just a symbol for what can happen automatically, which is an awareness of what we're saying and a registering of what we're saying that can see simultaneous to us being, to the energy that's completely involved coming up, and can see, wow, look at the doership and attachment contained in all of that.
So, as that continues to be released from the body, the knot, does that lead to experiencing yourself as as complete, as whole more? Does that have anything to do with?
Yes, the more doership and attachment there is in the system, the less capacity there is to just watch life, and the more tendency to be involved in a very condensed and focused way on a particular movement of the person, as I am doing this and I need it to be a certain way, rather than a watching of the person functioning and knowing that the body is functioning and the outcome is going to be something. The witnessing, what really watches the body. I'm talking and there's something that watches my hands moving. I find it very peculiar. And when I say something, it's this essence of who we are that is both simultaneously functioning through the body and feeling I am the person, and simultaneously watching all of that happening. And the more of the doership that's in the system, the less of the simultaneous watching, and the more involvement in the outcome, or in the action, and investment in the outcome, needing it to be a certain way, which is a very different feel to watching life unfold and wondering what's going to happen next. And that spaciousness means we get to rest. The resting is probably, is where If we're resting, we feel like we're both the person acting and at the same time got this spaciousness that watches, and there's a sense of being, there's a sense of being connected in the heart. And one explanation of what it feels like, which doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but one explanation is I rest in the heart. There is a sense of beingness, and linked to that beingness is this witnessing awareness. And it feels like the heart is the junction point where impersonal consciousness of Source links to the body and then turns into the personal consciousness. So resting in that I am is the junction, the link, the point in between the manifest and the unmanifest, you could say, or the point between the personal and the impersonal, where consciousness of Source that in this manifestation can't experience life unless it's functioning through a body. So consciousness of Source links to the body, and the linking point is the heart, the spiritual heart, or the center, home. And we can just rest there. So when we're watching life and saying it's neither good nor bad, we're resting here. You can't be in your head and just repeating, this is neither good nor bad. It's neither good nor bad. It needs to really be a dropping back and seeing the fact that I missed my bus or my aeroplane as what is, because I don't know. My idea of how life needs to look is just Roger's idea about God's creation. And so if we start to see Roger's idea about God's creation is only going to be spot on by just pure luck, and most of the time Roger's idea is going to be different to what actually has been created, either in little fine details or in very radically drastic details. Like Roger had the idea that he was meant to get on the plane and be in a certain place. God had a different plan. And so when God's plan unfolds, which is what is happening in each moment, if we can reconcile and go, that's what life was meant to turn out like, we're then not saying missing the plane was bad, because missing the plane is bad only relative to my idea of what life is meant to be turned out like. If life is meant to be me in the airport, then if I didn't miss my plane, I wouldn't be in the airport. If I didn't miss my plane, life wasn't meant to be me in the airport. So if we can come back to a point where whatever happens is what life is meant to look like, then we really have this capacity to rest and be one with what is, instead of being, that's where I had left it off last time, the separation. And I was saying separation is not, or the end of separation is not the end of an experience that where we feel like, so we think about separation as being experiential separation. And then we can have peak experiences where that separation falls away. What that's really showing us is the non-duality of life. The fact that the tree and the other tree and the chairs and the people, from one perspective, seem like many. And then the peak experience happens of a non-dual peak experience. And it shows us, wow, it actually is just one thing. Like, wow. I I couldn't have conceived of this. The teachings were telling us, right? And we sort of can get it, but we don't really get it sometimes. And then there's a oneness experience, and then it's like, wow, I get it. It's all one, and the body is part of that oneness, and the thinking, and all of it is witnessed as one, and it's experiential. And we think that's enlightenment, knowing it as one experientially. It's a peak experience which is there to show us something, like a behind-the-scenes look. So that we, when life comes back to being duality again, which is what I suggest is what's meant to happen, what does happen as the process progresses, we now know, because we were shown a behind-the-scenes experience, that even though it's experienced as duality, fundamentally it's all non-dual. So what I was talking about before. And the experience then reverts back to being one of duality, where you are a person aware of the tree, whereby it seems the tree is, outside of you, which it is, and that everything is separate. But we've had the view that shows us the whole thing is an experience, an arising, an appearance, a multi-sensory, multi-layered experience. And then it can revert back, and we know it's still the same fundamentally, but it doesn't have to be experienced as oneness. As long as our thinking doesn't then start separating, so the real separation that ends forever is the separation of judging the other as separate and an independent and the doer, myself as separate and independent as a doer, which doesn't require us to have an experience of being merged. That's not what, when I say judging the other as a doer, as a separate independent entity, is a psychological overlay. It's a psychological overlay that says you are independent and insulated from life. And you're the doer, you're the one that controls, there's this little man in the head that we know ourselves as, that's the doer, and everyone has one of those, and you're a separate independent entity just happening to walk around in this world. And that's the attitude of separation. With that attitude, we're always going to see the other as a competitor, as an enemy, as a rival, as a threat, rather than seeing that we're in this experience of life, all playing our role. The trees are exactly where they're meant to be, and the branch falls off at exactly the time it's meant to fall off as part of the one movement of life. And so if we can see that it was my destiny for the person to pick up my backpack and run off with it when I'm not looking, my destiny, life then delivered my destiny through the other playing their role. So I was destined to experience the pain of losing my backpack. That may have had very important things in it. And so that pain can be viewed as part of the experience of life. And it becomes much more magical in a sense. Or let's not use the word magical. It just becomes part of the awesomeness of life. It's not pleasurable awesome. It's just seen as part of the whole. And so then we don't have an attitude of separating ourselves from pain and making pain invalid and pleasure valid. So it's the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome that creates the psychological separation. When they fall away, the experience is still one of duality, still one of separation of a circumstantial sort. But the attitudinal separation has fallen away. And then we're left with peace of mind. And the peace of mind comes because we are always connected to Source, meaning there is a deep recognition that we are part of life, and therefore the speaking is life functioning through me, which means I'm connected to life and I'm being moved by life. So if I know myself as not the doer, which would be, if I know myself as the doer, I'm a separate independent entity, not connected to life, not being lived by life, but being lived by me, the doer. Now I'm separated from life, not connected to Source. That falls away, and resting in my heart, I feel the beingness and the awareness, feeling like that's the junction point where consciousness of Source connects to the human being, and knowing that if that consciousness isn't there, the human being doesn't function. The human being isn't aware of the world if the consciousness isn't there, and that the human being is functioning according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning, which is part of life. So whenever I'm speaking, whenever I'm moving, I know it's only because I'm connected to life. So always being connected to life, always being connected to Source, means knowing oneself as not separate, as not the doer, without an attachment to outcomes, resulting in peace of mind.
Since I've been exposed to the teachings, I luckily became more relaxed in general. My question is, I can feel a kind of movement towards myself rather than going outside in the world. And I'm a bit worried about this because I doubt if this is the right movement that should happen once you're exposed to the teachings. I might compare myself with others who become more lively or are going more out into the world, and for me it's the extreme opposite. So my question is, how can I differentiate between relaxation and lethargy and between surrendering and negligence?
Yeah. Well, the process often requires quite a bit of energy, because part of the process is the undoing of belief systems, a reconfiguring of the whole body system. And that requires energy, almost like the immune system requires a lot of energy to do its work. And when we're sick, the immune system requires a whole lot more energy than normal to do its work. And so we get tired when we're sick, for example. The reconfiguring process and the dissolving of belief systems is what you can look at as the energetic immune system at work. And that immune system starts to get powered up when it receives certain new conditioning, new information, essentially empowers it to start functioning in ways that in the past it wasn't able to function as. And so that requires energy, and so what we find is that we are less interested in doing the things that we used to do because there is less energy in the body, is one reason. The other reason is we've come to see that